Hey there! In this Programmer Reviews Programming Games video, we'll take a look at Glitchspace. We'll check out what kind of game it is and what kind of programming aspects it has. I'm also going to score it on some criteria, such as if you can learn something about programming by playing it. Glitchspace is a game about getting from point A to point B. Sometimes you can just walk, but most of the time you'll have to reprogram some cubes to help you. In some ways, the gameplay reminds me of Portal, but without, well, portals. You move around in a first-person perspective and figure out how to get past the obstacles the game puts in your way. The way you avoid the obstacles is by reprogramming red cubes or cuboids or whatever the game calls them. I'm using the word program very loosely here. Most of the time you're just changing some attributes such as the position of the cube in the world or its rotation. For example, let's say you need to get across a chasm which is too far to jump. You might place down a cube, then step on it, and reprogram its position 50 units towards the opposite edge of the chasm. Many of the early puzzles are simple like this, teaching you the basics of the programming model in the game. At the start, the choices of reprogramming tools are fairly limited. You can move a cube around, but not much else. As you go through the game, you get more and more tools for this. For example, later in the game you get access to some more interesting physics-related programming commands. This lets you solve some of the more interesting and challenging puzzles you'll encounter later. However, sometimes the difficulty comes more from the game simply limiting the available choice of tools for some particular puzzle. The reprogramming itself is done in a user interface which is a little bit like a flowchart. You create nodes, such as a scale node or a node for the number 10. You then connect these nodes together to get the result that you want. For example, if you were to connect the number 10 to a scale node, this would increase the size of a cube by 10 times. The type of programming where you use a visual tool to connect nodes together like this is often known as visual programming. The way Glitchspace uses this makes it very easy to approach even to those who have never done any programming whatsoever. Once you learn the basics, reprogramming things, it becomes quite intuitive. Since the cubes that you reprogram exist in a three-dimensional space, having a basic understanding of how 3D space is represented in games or such, it can be helpful in solving some of the puzzles. But the game does a very good job of showing you the ropes. Even though you'll be using things like vectors, it doesn't really matter if you have no idea what that is. The game shows you how things work in an easy to understand way, and this is helped more by the fact that you can actually see the cubes move around as you play with the settings. Later in the game, the reprogramming becomes a bit more complex, but you won't really be doing much programming per se. You'll eventually see nodes which create conditions such as if a number is bigger than 10, then something happens. But you don't really add those in yourself. Rather, these mostly exist as something you have to understand in order to progress through a puzzle. For example, perhaps a cube is blocking your way. In order to get past it, you have to move it to the side. As you look at the cube's program, you might see a condition like, let's say if two objects are touching this cube, move to the left. Sometimes they can be a bit more complex like that, but that really is the extent of programming in the game. As such, the game doesn't really provide large challenges in terms of programming. While someone totally new to programming can learn some basic concepts, the challenge in the game is more in the puzzles themselves. Some of the puzzles, they had me scratching my head for a while, but not really because of the programming aspect. It was more a question of how do you combine the basic pieces of programming with what the game gives you in the world in order to solve a specific puzzle. And although it has some basic programming components, it's kind of difficult to compare it with any real programming language. While it seems that the programming model in the game could in theory support more complex programs, the limited choices in the tools that you have seems to somewhat get in the way. The visual programming, flowcharts type of design, it's also not very widely used in practice. There are some languages like LabVIEW, but they are only used within their own fairly limited niches. Alright, what about the scoring? First, is Glitchspace a fun and interesting game? Some of the first things that you notice when you start playing, they are the visuals and the soundtrack. it really gave me a sort of a cool retro cyberspace kind of feel, you know, something like from Tron or old science fiction, where the character goes into some kind of a virtual world. The levels themselves, they are fairly simple in design and could maybe use a little bit more variety, but there's a few interesting sights that you can see from time to time, and overall it's a pretty neat aesthetic. The music, if you can really call it music, it's fairly simple and atmospheric. It's supposed to be inspired by Brian Eno's works, and you can definitely hear some similarities. It fits the game's atmosphere, evoking a sort of a futuristic vibe. I can't really tell if there's any kind of a story in the game, but despite this, it kind of takes you through this journey as you play through it, as it brings you towards a destination at the end of the game. Now, the visual flowchart diagram programming interface, it's actually fairly intuitive. The game also guides you through new concepts as they are introduced, so you'll usually know how to combine things together to get what you want. I'm going to give Glitchspace a 4 out of 5 for fun. The game has a pretty cool aesthetic to it, and the puzzles have enough variety to keep you interested in playing. You probably won't be getting stuck even if you've never done any programming, as there aren't really any complex programming topics involved. The fact the game was short probably increased the score slightly, as it feels like it could have gotten repetitive if the game was any longer. Now, how about practicality? Is the game going to teach you anything about programming? Even though the game's programming aspect is quite intuitive, it isn't particularly complex. Some of the puzzles need you to do something a bit more complicated, but this is usually achieved by using a somewhat simple program to produce some effect in the world. The two most advanced programming concepts that exist in the game are conditions and types. In the case of conditions, you usually don't write them yourself. Rather, the game gives you a program that includes conditions, which you then must understand in order to figure out how to solve the puzzle in question. The type system aspect comes into play in connecting nodes together. Each node has inputs and outputs, which you use to connect the nodes together. However, not all nodes accept every other kind of node. For example, if you want to move a platform, you can't simply give it a number. Instead, you have to first put the number into a vector, which tells the direction of the movement, and then you put the vector into the move command. This is vaguely similar to some type system features in programming languages like C or Java. I'm giving Glitchspace 1.5 out of 5 for practicality. Although it doesn't really have any particularly complex programming in it, it does require a basic understanding of sequential logic and how to use several smaller pieces to construct a larger thing. Some of the later puzzles also require you to understand how conditions work, which is a pretty common aspect in programming. Overall, Glitchspace is a game a bit more about solving puzzles, and the programming aspect is just a simple tool you use to do that, rather than being the primary focus of the game. This is not necessarily a bad thing. When I was playing Glitchspace, I wasn't really in the mood for writing really complicated programs. Glitchspace gave me a kinda nice chill game with some light programming elements, which was pretty much exactly what I was hoping for. It only took me about 3 hours to complete the game, but it's currently available totally for free, so I don't have any complaints about the shortness. If you're interested in trying out the game yourself, there's a Steam link in the description of this video. There's also a Sandbox Mode in it, which can give you some more stuff to do, but at least personally, I wasn't quite sure what I would do with it, so instead I just tried to break the game, which gave me a couple of good laughs. I would recommend Glitchspace to anyone with a few hours to spend on solving some puzzles. It's not a hugely complicated game, but the programming puzzles can give you some nice brain teasers. The game also supports virtual reality headsets, so if you own one of those, this might be one of the only VR compatible titles with programming aspects to it as of creating this video. Alright, I hope you found the review interesting. I will be reviewing more programming games on this channel in the future, so stay tuned if that's a topic you like. For more details on the scoring criteria I was using and a couple of other things, check the description of the video. Thanks for watching.